the session is the value of culture, and we have Geoffrey Brown, the moderator of the session, and the conversation would be between Pier, Luigi, Sacco and Dea Vidovic. And Geoffrey, please, the floor is yours. Please introduce yourself and the speakers. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to have been invited to moderate this session of the Cultural Accelerator. This topic, the value of culture, is one of those fundamental questions that we need to explore before we can move on to look at the practical tools that can highlight the value of culture and can provide greater opportunities for experiences, for enjoyment, and for participation. I am delighted that I am joined by two expert panelists who are going to discuss this particular topic. They both have extensive CVs, so I'm going to allow them to talk about themselves if they so wish. Dea Vidovic from Croatia is currently running the Kultura Nova Foundation, which is an extremely interesting initiative that is slightly distant from government and which provides support and encouragement to culture across Croatia. Pier Luigi Sacco is an Italian academic who's, I don't know where to start. Pier Luigi Sacco has been involved in cultural policy and philosophy and analysis and research for many, many years, and we're delighted that he is able to participate as well. I'm going to firstly ask each of our panelists to how they define this phrase, the value of culture. It is potentially such a broad phrase. What does it mean? Value to whom? Do we mean value to individuals? Do we mean value to communities, to society, to national identity, to personal fulfillment? There are so many ways in which one can interpret this particular phrase. And it's also true that definitions can vary in the light of context, geography, and time. And in particular, I'm going to ask our panelists to sort of try and focus on what they feel we should be discussing in this particular session, given the overall topics of Cultural Accelerator and its goals to help us towards practical tools to address some of the challenges. So, first of all, over to Dea. Dea, what's your definitions of the value of culture?
Thanks, Geoffrey, so much, and hello to everyone. It is really my pleasure to be here with you today and share my tools and experience and exchange, especially with Pier Luigi Sacco. And thanks to organizer for being invited me and give me this opportunity. But to come back, Geoffrey, to your question, I think there is a great number of perspectives from which we can consider the value of culture. Exploring the value from different perspectives, the contrast in understanding the values appear. There is no semantic standard and a meaning for the notion of value. Value is not fixed attribute or inherent quality. It should rather be understood as a multiple, continuously changing and interacting variables. In that line, the value is a discursive construct. It means that it depends on the discourse within which it appears. Talking about the value of culture, one of the first issues that come up is conceptual clarity, the definition of culture. What does it mean? One of the more demanding tasks of the cultural policy is to define the concept of culture. The complexity of this concept is manifested in a numerous definition of culture, not only throughout the history, but also in a current time. Historically, the notion of culture encompassed a wide range of meanings and underwent an evolutionary shift from a material to a metaphorical understanding. And since the 19th century, the understanding of culture originates through the two basic registers, artistic and aesthetic on one side and anthropological on the other side. The shift towards understanding culture within the social processes opened the articulation of culture in the field of cultural policy. In the second half of the 20th century, the cultural policy recognized the economic and the social values of culture. So this endless ability of culture to be used for various purposes led to the application of instrumental approaches in cultural policy, where culture was understood as a tool for achieving goals outside the cultural and artistic field. In the context of the value of culture, a form of fixed value already exists, and on some of them I will remind during my intervention, with the constant tension to create a framework in which the value of culture can be discussed and contested. The debate around the notion of culture within the cultural policy in the last 70 years, basically after the Second World War, has developed on the binary logic, the binary distinction among two different, in some cases opposing meanings of the notion of culture, depending on the perspective from which we are exploring the value of culture, of course. There is a spectrum of culture, we know, a wide range of cultural practices and forms of cultural values as well, among which many of them are marginalized by the dominant paradigm within the cultural policy. One of those pairs identifies culture with a big C and a little c. The first one, with a big C, derives from Matthew Arnold, and the other one, with a little c, from anthropology. Culture with a big C is a work and practices of intellectual activities that basically it looks on the narrow understanding of culture basically only as arts, while culture with a little c is everything that defines us as a human beings. This polarity brings us to another pair, the elite and the popular culture, or high and a low culture. High culture is reserved for cultured and educated elite people, while low culture is a culture for the common people. Low culture is a derogatory term for forms of popular culture that have mass appeal. The polarization between elite and popular culture opened up also the distinction between the professional and amateur engagement in cultural creation and the production. Cultural policy making has constantly been dealing with that duality and has failed while trying to improve the cultural policy system. If we only look at the two cultural policy paradigms, for example, the democratization of culture and the cultural democracy, we can witness the mentioned failures of both concepts. So both paradigms were coined with the aim of increasing cultural participation. Cultural democratization takes a top-down approach, focuses on high culture, and the experts are the ones who decide and determine what are aesthetically superior forms of arts. As a critique to this paradigm, cultural democracy appeared during the 1970s. And the idea behind the cultural democracy was to provide equal opportunities for citizens to be culturally active on their own terms. Although it represents a step forward from passive to active cultural participation, and in spite of policy and rhetorical support to participation, in many cases the reality does not follow this policy discourse. And this brings us also to the fact that the different cultural policy models created different instruments within legislation, planning, and financing. One of the distinctions of financial instruments is related to the publicly funded cultural organizations and their non-for-profit activities, and on the other hand, commercially oriented cultural goods that depend on the market and economic logic. And here the tension between aesthetic and economic values appear. Economic arguments underline the economic contribution of arts, jobs, economic growth, and economic of local economy, and so on, while the aesthetic experience is something personal, intimate. It relates to perception and emotion, pleasure, captivation, empathy, cognitive growth, and many other immediate private and the public benefits in the long term. That bring us to another important feature of culture, and this is the intrinsic role of art that embeds values beyond measures. Instrumental value is opposite to intrinsic values, and it reduces all cultural activities and content, including concerts, performances, exhibitions, and many other, to commodity and their values to prices. These instrumentalist arguments are largely implemented since the 1980s, with the main demands to prove accountability and demonstrate the material benefit of arts and the impact of cultural investment in the economy, society, tourism, and many other fields. But in the canon of contemporary arts and culture, the aesthetic experience is almost entirely conditioned and orchestrated by the cultural system. So the experience of the relationship between art's work and audience involves an army of mediators, from curators to pedagogues. In that context, it seems that the division into instrumental versus intrinsic value is inadequate and outdated, because the boundaries between these categories are completely blurred and unclear. Although culture receives public support in many countries all over the world, there are differences in the amount and the form of such support of the states, region, or city. And thanks to public funding, but also many other kinds of the funding, citizens pay a smaller portion of the cost of cultural content or cultural goods. At the same time, economy also plays an important role in many fields of cultural and artistic activity, and predominantly in the cultural industry. Artists, cultural and creative workers insist to be well paid. Politicians that approve and grant public subsidies for arts use the income generated through the arts project to justify public investment in culture. On the other hand, citizens willingly and sometimes quite eagerly pay for arts experiences and for their personal gain and ownership of art and cultural products. And sometimes the price is set very high, from hundreds of thousands of euros, for example, for Anish Kapoor's color print, to millions of euros for Rem Koolhaas' architectural houses design, for example. So who can say that money does not count and that the money is not important in the world of arts and culture? But at the same time, the arts and culture is one of the most precarious one. Many published studies and the policy documents in Europe have pointed to the fact that the insecurity and non-standard forms of work in the cultural sector have become frequently occurrences. Although the situation depends on the country and the cultural policy model, basically the variety of legal framework for the status of artists and the cultural workers, generally speaking, in the last 2 decades, precariousness has become standard for the cultural sector, especially for all artists and the cultural professionals who are self-employed, for whom uncertainty became inherent and the potential source of stress, but also the only option for survival. Artists and cultural professionals' earnings are typically low, but they freely choose their creative lives instead of professional careers that would bring them a bigger income. They choose artistic values instead of economic rationality. These issues that arise here is why is that choice so radical? Why is it positioned on the binary side of economic potency and abundance to the precariousness and scarcity? Why does the discussion and practice of evaluating arts and cultural work have to end up in a puzzle on the morality of value that affirms the surviving artist as a morally noble and successful creative workers as a morally corrupt? This issue of moral normativity is one that blurs the vision of a more balanced and diverse scope of evaluating engagement in cultural and artistic work in the present times. And we need to talk about it more. We need to go beyond the conceptual dichotomies that I briefly described. And just to finalize, effort to find the balance between more humanistic and less economic perspectives and approaches represent one of the most significant challenges for cultural policy of the 21st century, especially if it would be developed as a participatory, democratic, and inclusive cultural policy.
Because of my distinguished age and wisdom, I've been around long enough to have experienced those transitions that you talked about and see the pendulum swing to providing support for art's sake, to the instrumentalization of culture in the 80s and 90s and the impact that that still leaves us with today. But I won't say anything. I'll stop. Pier Luigi, I'm going to pass straight over to you for your comments on this topic.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Well, Dea said really lots about that, so I'm fortunate to speak after her because so many was already put on the table. I would synthetically say that value is basically what makes relevant, what makes culture relevant for any specific constituency, any specific, let's say, player in the field. And I would say that it's practically impossible to find a human being that has no notion whatsoever of how culture is valuable to them. Because the real point is what kind of culture in what circumstances, as you were pointing out at the beginning. And yes, I also agree that the chronology that they have proposed to us makes a lot of sense, but it's a chronology that is probably also better read against the alternative paradigms for cultural production that have emerged throughout our cultural history. And of course, the most ancient one, which is revealing because in a sense we are turning back to that. In a moment, I will explain what I mean, is that for a very, very long time, culture has been simply intertwined into our daily experience as human beings. I just make a silly question. Who are the authors of, let's say, the popular songs that all of us sing, or the fairy tales from? There are fairy tales that are millennia old. Well, they are not signed because basically in an oral culture, what happens is that you hear something, you re-elaborate what you hear, you give your own version, and you just hand over your version to somebody else to remix it in turn, and so on and so forth. So for a very long time, the very notion of authorship that is ingrained into our notion of what culture is about the creation of somebody who signs what they create because they want to leave their mark. But for a very, very long time, this has been not part of the human experience of culture. And again, to make a silly question, who designed the pyramids? Who is the architect or the engineer who's the author of the Cheops pyramid or Khafre pyramid? We don't know. And the reason is very simple. We don't know because nobody cared to know who were the authors, because they were just basically providers of services, exactly as it could have been a plumber today that does not sign their plumbing work. And because clearly the only author at the time was the pharaoh. So what I mean is that there has been a very, very long time in which culture has been part of our daily experience. And the very notion of asking why culture was important was nonsensical for the simple reason that it was part of the structure. It was like asking, why is your daily life important? Well, in a sense, it's a deep philosophical question. But on the surface, it's a silly question because clearly it's the structure of your experience. So what has been interesting is that through time, we have developed production regimes which have boxed culture into a specific set of rules. And Dea was pointing out very clearly what have been the consequences of the longest lived of these regimes, the so-called patronage regime, that has been informing basically our notion of culture. For example, is the patronage regime that is responsible of the distinction between, let's say, high culture and low culture, that even more derogatorily can become highbrow and lowbrow. So with the idea that somehow people who have refined cultural taste are better and or even more intelligent than people who don't. These notions are notions in which culture is basically defined by the experts. Culture is whatever the experts take it to be. And even before is what the patrons take it to be, because it's the patrons that in the first place make culture possible. So the notion of value from this point of view is recognition by the experts. And this particular notion is still extremely deep rooted, especially in the European vision of the value of culture. So any kind of, let's say, economic or other kind of evaluation of the role of culture or the value of culture on any other kind of meaning, that is not just the recognition of the creative excellence, is seen as a distortion, is seen as a profanation, so to speak, of the constituent role and the value of culture as something that establishes a new field of meaning. We can be a bit, let's say, upset by this notion, because clearly the definition of the experts is also something that has to undergo the irony of history. If we take, for example, what were the expert judgment about literature in the 18th century, probably, just make an example for Italy. The best author for theater would have been Pietro Metastasio, and Goldoni would have been, let's say, if not a ridicule author, at least certainly a second-tier author, because he was writing his plays in dialect, and they were much more mundane, whereas Metastasio has this neoclassical grandeur. Today, nobody puts Metastasio on stage, but Goldoni is on stage all the time. So that's just an example of how cultural value, seen from this angle, really changes from epoch to epoch. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that the fact that the patronage era has rooted the notion of value into recognition by the experts also had very positive dimensions. For example, innovation. The fact that you are addressing the experts is particularly important in establishing, let's say, setting a bar for cultural innovation in which you define conventions. And by the way, not necessarily in agreement with the experts, because much of cultural innovation generally is carried out by defying the ruling experts, the ruling canon. But nevertheless, this notion that culture is culture for culture's sake. And so you should really just dive into the possibilities of, let's say, broadening the possibilities of language, of the use of symbols, the conceptualization of what meaning is in the first place. All these dimensions have been conducive to the incredible stream of cultural innovation that we have witnessed all over the world, not necessarily only, I'm taking the Western perspective, and I'm sorry about that, because it's the one that I know best, but not certainly because it's the only relevant one, or just the primarily relevant one. So I think that this kind of dynamics, of course, has had huge global variations across time and space. But nevertheless, the fact that there has been a form of patronage for most of the modern era, for example, worldwide, although in different guises, has been, of course, a characteristic of this dynamics of cultural innovation. Why all of a sudden there has been this instrumentalist turn? Why there is a moment in which the instrumental value of culture and, for example, the economic impact becomes so fundamental? Well, simply because patronage is not the only regime of cultural production, and especially with the Industrial Revolution and the industrialization cycle of the 19th century, clearly you can create a cultural industry exactly as you can create, let's say, a steel industry. And the consequence of this has been that clearly what is the driver of a cultural industry? Of course, it is the market. So whereas value as defined within the patronage regime has to do with the evaluation, with the assessment of the experts, in the case of the cultural and creative industry, of course, the value is the market response. You can be, let's say, in some sense, extremely well-reputed movie director, but once your movie hits the box office and the box office response is very deluding, well, in a sense, you have a problem, because you can have the best possible reviews for your movie, but your movie is an economic investment and a very risky one. And if you don't recover your investment, you are in a serious trouble. Even if you are recognized as a movie director, you could not be able to shoot your next movie. And for example, there have been clear examples of failures in this regard, in which you had, let's say, really famous, think of Michael Cimino with the Hunter first, but then Heaven's Gate. And I mean, the fact that Heaven's Gate was one of the biggest economic failures in the history of movie production, of course, clearly prejudicated the possibility of Michael Cimino to shoot more movies, and what kind of movies. So what I'm saying is that the fact that clearly the cycle of culture and creative industry started in the early 20th century, but the apex of this was really visible, especially in Europe, but not only Europe, only after the Second World War. Of course, there has been the dominance of the US, and again, an irony of history, because most of the technology and the models for culture and creative industry came from Europe. But since Europe was so deeply committed to the idea of patronage, clearly Europe didn't really tap into the opportunity, and the US feasted on that. But the really interesting thing is that with the prevalence of culture and creative industry, it's inevitable that the emphasis on the economic dimension of value becomes central. And in some sense, ironically, again, Europe imported this notion that they initially created, so to speak, from the US, and more generally from this new global economy of culture and creative content that was clearly setting another standard in terms of economic impact. But now things are changing again, because what we are now seeing emerging is yet another regime. And by the way, all these regimes are not substitute for one another. They coexist. Today, we still have institutions that work under the patronage regime, institutions that work as culture and creative industries, but we have an emerging regime now that we could call the open platform regime, that is basically related, of course, to the digital economy and digital content production. But the really interesting thing is that the deep roots of this have nothing to do with the digital. The deep roots of this have to do with the flourishing of subcultures at the end of the Second World War, because the digital is simply implementing a phenomenon that was already happening, a phenomenon that is typical of subcultures, in which people want to have a say. They don't want to be passive audience. They want to participate in the narration, in the creation of the story. And what the digital technology has done, especially in the last 20 years, has been simply to enable people to speak their mind, but that demand to speak their mind was already there. What kind of notion of value emerges from this? It's a notion of social value. It's a notion of social impact, because this new regime has one characteristic that makes it particularly interesting. What is the criterion for success? It's not necessarily market response, because most of the digital economy that we consider today new is, economically speaking, 20th century. I mean, Google is 20th century from the point of view of the revenue model. They make revenue on using information in a certain way, and most of the digital media that we see today are still forms of broadcasting. It's not just, you know, the usual broadcasting of the cultural industry is starting to be personal broadcasting. But the really interesting, the really new thing, which is still a bit, and then I quickly close. But the really interesting new thing, is that the new possibilities that we should really explore that generate this social value have to do with co-creation. So what is interesting about the new regime is that you can create arenas for cultural production in which people are connected together, also in the sense of jointly devising and jointly developing meaning. And that's one of the reasons why today, what really makes sense is not simply content that goes viral. It's content that creates connection between people. So from this point of view, the social impact and developing new methodologies for evaluating the social impact of culture becomes the new challenge. And that's my last word. I want to stress that the European Commission, from this point of view, has set a very ambitious new standard with the publication in 2018 of the new European Agenda for Culture that makes of these goals of social impact one of the new pillars of the European cultural policy, or better, the vision of cultural policy, because of course the European Union does not have an autonomy on cultural policy, which is still with the member states. And by the way, the dialogue, for example, that was established between the European Union and the Eastern Partnership, so all the countries, for example, on the eastern border of Europe, including, of course, Azerbaijan, is very much about that.
One of the things that both of you have touched on is this concept of patronage. And I think we can sort of, go back to once we shifted from the model of independent, patronage by aristocrats and so on and so forth, to a governmental model of patronage, that became through your ministries of culture. That's common in many Western countries. And that's been an interesting development, because I think one of the things one could argue that many ministries of culture, and I'm not speaking about any individually, so this has nothing to do with the UK or Italy or Azerbaijan or anything, but many ministries of culture have entrenched traditional views of culture, and particularly the high art views of culture. And ministries over the years have sometimes gone on with that particular approach, but others have felt that maybe things are changing for whatever reason it might be, and that they need to invent a new system of patronage, or they need to explore and expand that. And one of the models has been the establishment of arm's length bodies, so taking the responsibility away from the Ministry of Culture to an independent agency. And ministries have done this, governments have done this. Again, I'm not speaking about Azerbaijan or any particular country, but many governments have done this for several reasons. One is, it is potential for definitions and values to be broader. And that's partly because if you set up an independent agency, then it's no longer the government's fault. If the independent agency chooses to support radical contemporary art, well, that's not the government's decision. It's not me, the Minister of Culture, supporting that particular terrible painter. That's the independent agency supporting culture. Now, this is a good thing in many ways, but it sometimes can be a challenging activity as well. And I know that Dea, you are running Kultura Nova in Croatia, which is an example of one of these agencies. And in terms of moving forward, the sort of discussions about the value of culture and what might be supported through government funding, and that's not the only way of supporting culture, but through government support. Can you talk briefly, I'm afraid, but about the way in which Kultura Nova has approached and your experiences?
Yeah, thank you, Geoffrey. And this is a really good switch from the somehow theory to the really practical examples. And of course, I'm talking about the Croatian context, the post-socialist, post-war, post-Yugoslav country with the new economic and political system, capitalism and democracy, the country that belongs to the third wave of democratization. And this is the last member state that joined the European Union. So all that factors have had a profound effect on the frame of references within the Kultura Nova Foundation is working. And Kultura Nova is a public body, as you said, established by the Republic of Croatia 10 years ago, but it's also the results of successful bottom-up initiatives led by civil society organizations, meaning non-profit, non-governmental associations, which came out with the idea of establishment of separate foundation that would be dedicated to their purpose, their interest, and basically their needs. So after years of advocacy process led by NGOs and civil society organizations, the Republic of Croatia decided to, based on this arm's length principles, establish Kultura Nova Foundation and give the foundation the purpose to provide a professional and financial support to civil society organization in really specific cultural niche of contemporary arts and culture. And why basically civil society organization which represent part of the independent culture, decided to came out with this idea, because the Croatian cultural policy model dominantly focused to public cultural institutions as a legacy of previous socialist system. And thanks to this, we really have a big, enormous, strong public institutions, but somehow during the 90s, they lose their connections with the public, with the contemporary arts and culture in many cases, and also with this international arena and with transnational exchange. And this position took by the civil society organization, which became really important player in the contemporary arts and culture, and recognized after years by the politicians as an important stakeholder, relevant stakeholders that somehow needs should be fulfilled or give some kind of the feedback. So based on that, in that kind of the context, Kultura Nova appears. And we started to operate 10 years ago as a grant making and operating foundation. So it means that we provided grants to civil society organizations, the part of the independent culture, which operate in the contemporary arts and culture. So in that sense, we provide support for really radical kind of artistic and cultural practices, which give the voices of marginalized people and the group of our society. On the other side, we also, through our own activities in education and research and cultural policy making, try to change the frame and to influence the frame, and also through that way to support and to encourage civil society organizations to work in a more sustainable environment. We try as an institution, as a public body, to listen and to create our policy through the co-creation and different kind of the participatory process. And through one of that kind of the approach, we recognize the participatory governance as a concept which appears across the country and appears as a bottom-up initiatives, again, led by the civil society organization. So we basically recognize that our beneficiaries created different examples based on the participatory governance model, which means sharing responsibility within the public realm with the public sector in the governing of the public resources. And this model, of course, provide platform for encouraging citizens to enter decision-making process and to share this responsibility with the public sector. So recognizing that this practices and tendencies appear and develop around the country, and thanks to demands from our beneficiaries, we as a Kultura Nova decided to create the bigger support for this kind of the practices. So this is just one example in a way how the public body can be so reactive and proactive to the depends on the demands on the ground, on the cultural sector.
And it's really interesting, because I mean, I think part of the role as well, isn't it, is about making the public, in a sense, aware of the fact that that interaction is possible. That, you know, because sometimes, you know, in societies where people are not necessarily used to that sort of interaction, you have to stimulate that interaction in order to sort of get people engaged and so on. Pier, Luigi, I mean, I'm happy if you want to follow on with that, but I'm also interested in, I mean, you talked at one point about the cultural industries and they're sort of, I mean, one of the key factors there, of course, was the fact that was jumped on because politicians were generally felt to be people who would understand economics and economic impact more than they would understand culture. And so therefore, if culture was seen to have an economic impact, it would generate more support from politicians. I mean, you know, that all sort of went slightly horribly wrong. But where do you think we are now going in terms of, you know, the economic value hasn't gone away completely as being part of the value, and nor should it. You also talked about the social value and so on. I mean, if we have sort of a triangle with economic value and social value, is there the sort of people recognizing the cultural value in terms of the impact on individuals and their role in society and so on? I mean, is that a triangle that exists, or are we in a slightly different area these days?
Well, it really depends on the terminology, but social value, it's something that we could broadly conceive of as, let's say, if not opposed, complementary to economic value, which means that we are not particularly interested in how much value you generate directly through some form of market intermediation, but rather how you change certain types of human reactions, for example, cognitive or emotional reactions, or more generally behavioral reactions. Just let's make an example from the new canvas that is being generated in terms of policy design as a consequence of this change of perspective. Think, for example, of the relationship between cultural experience and access, mental health and well-being, and more generally health, not simply the mental dimension. In this case, clearly, it has very much to do on how people are influenced, for example, in their own, let's say, emotional regulation. Think of what's happening now during the pandemic. So many countries locked down, real challenge to the mental stability of people, because clearly people see their social relationships cut dramatically. And in this kind of circumstances, you have to cope, but you have very little experience to cope, because there's no precedent for this. What do you learn from? So as a consequence of this, we are seeing, for example, that lots of people are starting to develop a new kind of relationship with culture, which of course has created also a boom on the cultural industry side. Think, for example, of the skyrocketing profits for streaming content platforms, obviously. But not only that, what is clearly seen today is that the socially connecting dimension of culture, the fact that we can return to the public space, for example, and engage with people now, again, also physically, can be extremely rejuvenating from the point of view of mental health. So how do we understand this? This is not something that has to do with the judgment of an expert, of the pundit that decides that this is the good culture, this is the bad culture. Everybody has their own way to decide what matters for them. And that's what's really interesting. Just to make, and this reconnects very quickly to the comments of Dea and your own, in terms of the different patronage models. In fact, we have had very different public patronage models, because the original model, which, by the way, is the model that prevailed initially after the Congress of Vienna, 1815, because, of course, it was when the big European nation states were created. And public patronage at that stage was celebrating the cultural grandeur of our country. Then there has been, as you correctly pointed out, this arm's length revolution that has been particularly important starting from the 60s and in the 20th century. But this was arm's length, but still top down, very much top down. Because, of course, these arm's length institutions were there, they reached out to the public, but again, with this kind of a paternalistic attitude. I'll tell you what's good for you. Audience development, a notion that I personally despise, because it's a way to just explain to people what they should like and why. What's happening today in terms of these new models of public patronage is, as Dea correctly pointed out, it's becoming bottom-up. It's very much about facilitating the self-organization of the civil society and letting the civil society explore what kind of cultural forms of activity really matter for them. And it's not whether or not, let's say, they generate a lot of direct economic value added, because think, for example, in terms of mental health. If cultural participation makes us much more healthy and able to cope, how much public money are you sparing in terms of, for example, treatments that are not needed? So in this case, you do not have a direct economic impact. Nobody's selling anything or buying anything, but the indirect economic impact is huge, and at the same time, of course, you have a very clear way in which people can appreciate the value of this. So we have to change our mentality. It's not about impact, economic impact, yes or no. It's understanding that culture changes people, and this has lots of different consequences from the economic point of view, from the behavioral point of view, from the point of view of the kind of culture that we consider relevant, and so on and so forth.
That's absolutely right. It is interesting, though, that government, and I say that very broadly, but parts of government in some countries is also changing, and the idea of recognizing non-monetary value in terms of social policy, for example, is gaining ground. So there are new policies being introduced in the care service, in the prison service, and others where there can't be a direct monetary value. So slowly, sort of government mentalities that have been very, very focused on economic impact and value are changing.
Well, we are learning very quickly how to measure social value and more generally social change and social impact of certain forms of cultural policy. And here there is a very, very interesting methodological alliance between culture and the behavioral sciences. So, for example, we are learning to use tools from social psychology or even from neuroscience to understand, for example, how people are affected by certain forms of cultural experience and how this changes, for example, their empathic orientation towards other people, or how concretely they are made happy or able to cope with emotional shocks. So we are building a new kind of evidence, and this is at the beginning of a new cycle of research and of policy mainstreaming that is taken extremely seriously and increasingly seriously by the umbrella international organizations. For example, there has been a comprehensive scoping report from the WHO on the impact of cultural participation and health and well-being that creates, for example, a blueprint for possible future cultural policies that directly target issues like mental health or even health without any kind of qualification. So we are at the beginning. There's not yet, let's say, the gold standard to do this. But yes, evidence-based policy is really opening up new possibilities also in terms of measurement of social value.
Yes, I suppose it's the question of just persuading the people who are in charge of developing the policy to make sure that their definitions of evidence-based are broad enough to encompass the submissions across the sorts of channels we're talking about.
We already have some methods, some of them Pier Luigi mentioned already. It's important, of course, to think about the qualitative methods, not only on the quantitative methods, but also to think about this co-creation and participatory approach. And when you use the evidence-based for the policy making, the crucial things in how to translate the narrative, the policy narrative and the policy rhetoric to the practices. And this is in many countries in which we have a gap in the research and evidence-based policy. We also have this gap not only in on the national level, but also on the international level, the gap of translation between the rhetoric and what's happening in the practices. Because if we look in many challenges on which we are talking as a cultural sector, we already produce so many studies, so many policy documents on the European level, UNESCO level, this and that, But when it's come to the practice, what is basically put on the ground, then we still recognize that we fail. And this is the reason why we constantly try to rearrange, redesign, and to improve the policy making in order to implement the narrative within the policy. And this is the directions which I really recognize as the crucial in the future for making really serious step forward in cultural policy.
But there's one interesting comment which as well, which we won't have time to go into in detail, where I'll just read it. cultural modernization helps us to improve our own culture and also to get the best thing from cultural differences too. It is the great value to integrate to the world without losing our best cultural differences. Now that's really interesting because it's a really important factor, but of course it's a potential minefield. Because people want to make sure that you know, we are a global society in many, many ways. We may be global in terms of the way in which our communities include migrants from other countries who have their own cultures, which are evolving as they have moved to another country, and so on and so forth. And the challenge is indeed, how do we maintain our traditions and cultures and also allow others to maintain theirs, but also to become part of whatever evolves, and allowing this evolution. And that gets into a real minefield because we then get into questions which we don't have time to discuss about national identity and the way in which culture can be hijacked for that particular purpose.